All right, welcome back. We are Game 3001 in the summer 2022 semester at George Brown, and it's week 13, part 2 of our broadcast and recording together. And this week we're talking about utility theory. So we met on, last week we talked about goal-oriented behavior and rule-based systems. Should actually say systems there. And we kind of worked with Lab 7 to build an AI brain for the close combat enemy and the ranged combat enemy. And this week, we're talking about utility theory and action execution, how to do that. The lab, again, just a reminder, lab part 1, 2, 3, lab 7 is due this Sunday at midnight. So please make sure you get that done. And on the horizon, assignment 4 is next Sunday. Assignment 5 during lab time on the last week of class, as stated from Philip, because Philip is hosting your game production class this semester. Because he's going to be in both weeks, next week and the following week, so will we physically in class. So I will be doing lab 8 next week in class. That's how we're going to be doing it. And then we're also going to be doing the final presentations during our lab time in class live. All right, so that's what's happening in the next 2 weeks. I'm just putting it out there because now we know what Philip is doing. All right, so that's this week. We're sitting again at week 13, which is all about utility theories. There's a case study for Guild Wars 2 we're going to be talking about a little bit more. And again, next week it's all about tactical and strategic AI. And we'll talk more about that as we get closer. And let's move into the topic of today. But before we get to that, before we get to the topic, any questions, concerns, or anything like that with your assignment 4, which is due next week, assignment 4. Yeah, I'm putting it out there because if you do have a question or if you have a concern, you can stick around after. We'll talk about it. But I want to go over it with you just to make sure that you guys have everything you need for assignment 4. We're going to add to it with lab 8. Lab 8 is going to give you more for assignment 4, but for the most part, the labs and the assignments are related. All right, so utility theory, what is that? And how does that relate to goal-oriented behavior, the stuff we talked about last week? So last week, we're all about goals, motivations. And we also talked about insistence, like a value that we kind of put together that says that, how insistent is the goal and how discontent is the AI. And we want to reduce discontentment. We talked about that last week. But let's talk about a little bit more about motivation in more detail. So we're going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit this week and talk about utility. So again, when we think about theatrical actors, all right, maybe stereotypically, sometimes they ask things like, what's my motivation? Why is my character doing the things that they're doing? And AI designers sometimes ask the same stuff. They're like, so what's motivating your AI to do what they're doing? And motivation or goals, we talked about motivation and goals being the same last week for the discussion we had, but this week we're going to go delve more deeper into putting a number. How do we put that number? How do we evaluate the motivation or the goal that an AI might have? Okay, lots of ways to do that, of course, but one way we're going to do it is utility theory. And utility theory is not something that's new, and it's not something that's unique to AI by any means. Really, in a nutshell, like it says here, we have a bunch of available decisions and we score them using some kind of mathematical formula or algorithm. And the agent selects a course of action, whatever that action is going to be, from among the best scoring options. So whatever scores the highest, if you will. And the general concept is of a utility-based AI system is that every possible action is scored at once at the same time, and one of the top scoring actions is chosen, whatever the top scoring action happens to be. So that's kind of very straightforward. And going back to this slide here, the first slide, which is like, hey, what's my motivation? This also links back to, your narrative, like why is the game, the way it is? Why are your characters in that location? Why is the AI doing what they're doing, and so on? So there's lots and lots of questions that you can ask. And the more you ask those kinds of questions, the more contextual your game becomes and realistic, maybe more immersive for, for your player. And we know that, immersion is kind of an engagement related, like, how immersed and engaged you are, that kind of makes it how fun you are, how you get into that flow state, right, which we might talk about in another class. But anyways, so we're going to score the decisions based on a number, some kind of number we're going to assign to it. And we're going to evaluate the decision. We're going to have some kind of evaluator, and that is going to be our heuristic. So again, intelligent agents are grouped into 5 classes based on the degree of perceived intelligence and capability. Let's think about this. So there's some simple reflex agents, right? So they're basically just responding to some kind of state, as an example. So the game state or input, if you will. We might have model-based reflex agents, right? Goal-based agents. We talked about that kind of last week, right? We have utility-based agents, which we're going to be talking about this week. And the other one might be learning agents. And learning agents would be something where we use machine learning to learn the environment and kind of do it on its own. So here we're talking about utility-based agents. And when it comes to utility theory, we might have, your environment. So this is kind of your environment idea here. And there's some kind of perception that they have, or maybe a sensor suite. The sensors and precepts kind of feed into what the world is like now. And there might be an initial state that the character might have, the autonomous character. How the world evolves, maybe something changes in the world, less resources, more enemies, whatever, more players, that kind of stuff. And then what it will be like if I do action A. So we kind of predict what's going to happen if we do action A. And then how happy will I be in such a state? That's the utility. All right. So that's what we're going to kind of capture. So am I going to be happier or unhappier? And happiness, or we're talking about satisfaction or contentment in this case, instead of discontentment. So what action should I do now based on the possible action that I might do, action A, B, C, D, right? We kind of look at all these possible actions, and then we use our actuators, so hands and feet, animations, all those kind of things, in order for us to effect that action. And then we have an influence on the environment, and this becomes a feedback loop because we influence the environment with our actions. And this is using the AI I'm talking about. And it feeds back into, what we're going to do next, as an example. So this idea is very interesting when you read about it. And one possibility when we look at this kind of chart is how it can actually be negative as well, right? We might be stuck in a loop, right? We might put our AI in a loop depending on how we affect the environment. Let's talk more about that. So really, let's kind of zoom back out again. Utility theory, what the heck is that? We talk about utility theory. What is utility? And so on. It's been around a long time, way before games or computers. And it's part of game theory and economics and other fields as well. And the core idea is that every possible action or state within a given model can be described with a single uniform value. Okay, that's the idea. So we can assign a value to every kind of state that we're in. And this value is usually referred to as utility. And really, it describes how useful that particular action is within a given context. All right. So again, the context of the game world, the context of the narrative, where your player is at the given time compared to your enemies, and so on. Let's look at a small example in economics. For example, let's say you need a new toy for your cat. I love this example. So you go online and find the perfect one. One website has it for $4.99. While another website sells the exact same toy for $2.99, assuming delivery times are the same, you will likely choose the toy for $2.99. That option typically has a higher utility than the toy for $4.99 because in the end, you are left with more money. More money equals greater utility because you can do more with what you've got. Okay, that's the idea behind it. So this is kind of an economic example. But it gets more difficult when you compare values of two different things that aren't directly relatable, all right, or comparable. For instance, let's say in the same example, we have two websites that have different delivery times now. Okay, so we add that in too. So we have a toy for $4.99. It's going to arrive at your house in 2 days, while the toy for $2.99 will arrive in 5 days. And in this case, the choice is not so simple anymore because we're not comparing just price values, we're comparing times as well. And let's suppose there is some conversion between a time and money thing where we have to kind of value how much the time takes. We're going to add some kind of dollar value to it. We could say that each day is worth $1, right? We're assigning a value or weighting for that particular feature, and which means that the total cost of the $4.99 toy is $6.99. Because if you think about the $4.99 toy, again, takes 2 days, so that's $6.99. But if the $2.99 toy takes 5 days, as an example, well, then it's worth $7.99, let's say. Okay. So 5 days, $5 plus $2.99, $7.99. So the $4.99 toy now is the winner in this case because it costs you less in combined money and time, because let's suppose we put a value on time as well. It's not just a value about money, right? So this idea, this weighting of these two different kinds of aspects of, this activity you want to undergo. We want to buy a toy. We have a motivation to buy something. And we want to take, we have two possible choices, and we're going to decide between the one that has the highest utility, the one that we're going to get the most out of, right? That's how it works out, okay? So again, one thing to note is the utility is not the same as value. Value is a measurable quantity, such as the prices. Utility is the measure of how much we desire something, okay? And this can change based on the personality or the context of the situation, all kinds of stuff, right? It depends on a lot of different things, right? So what we value, and that can be related back to goals. You might have some kind of connection to a goal or a motivation. Example, if we're a billionaire, right? Someone like Elon Musk, maybe he's not a great example these days, but let's suppose you want to choose a cat toy for $4.99 because you might value time more than money, right? And the $2 you save is negligible. Who cares about $2 for a billionaire? On the other hand, if you're really poor and you still want to buy a toy for a family member, you might likely choose the cheaper toy and wait the extra time because you know what? $2 is really important to you, right? As an example. So that's the way it looks in terms of how it works. So the money has the exact same value, but the utility of the money is variable based on the context which it's being considered. Okay, so there's like two different contexts here. And again, I always say the same thing when it comes to real estate. Some people they have a lot of different choices when it comes to what they're doing. We always dream. Well, a lot of us dream about owning a bigger property, or even actually owning a property these days, and all those kind of things. And when you're in a situation where you don't have one and you're desiring it, it's huge. But when you're in a position like you have a lot, it becomes less. It's all relative. Again, it's another good example. If you've never had a car before, right? So the idea, this is a psychological thing. Your desire for the car is huge, and you're really excited when you drive the first car off a lot. Like you go to a brand new dealership, let's say, for example, let's say you have this capability, and for the first time ever, you buy a brand new car and you drive it off the lot. You might be super excited about doing it because it's your first time doing it. But over the years, as you continue to sell your old car and buy a new one, it's not as exciting. And the reason why it's not as exciting is because you've done this before. It's still exciting. Sometimes you have an amazing car you can buy. And if you're a car enthusiast, as an example, it might be awesome for you. But, that first time, that context of the first time makes a huge difference compared to something that you're doing over and over again. Okay. Same thing if you're playing a brand new game. There's a novelty to it, right? You're playing VR for the first time. You get really super excited, maybe if you've never done VR before, to play VR. You're going someplace that you've never been to before. You want to go visit Paris. It's a really important motivation or goal. You go to Paris for the first time. It's awesome because you've never been there before. And maybe you're going to really enjoy it. But if you go there a bunch of times, maybe it's not going to be as awesome as the first time, right, is what I'm saying. So this is the idea here as well. Its context is fluid and it can affect the value or the utility rather than the actual value of an item or an activity. Okay, so again, what we want to do is when we actually do some real calculation, this is like now going back to programming, okay? We want to kind of put a number to an action that we want to make, we want to take, right? And it's important that we score utility consistently. So somehow we want to be able to put everything in the same chart. Doesn't matter what type of activity, as an example. It may not all be the same, but we maybe want to put it inside of some kind of rating scale, right? From 0 to 5. A lot of times, though, we want to normalize those values because, let's say, for example, different activities, might have different scores. Example, health might be out of 100, but then you have another activity that you want to do, and that might be out of 20. And then you want to kind of take all these scores, whatever they are, and kind of normalize them in a range of 0 to 1. So all of them are the same, 0 to 1, where 0 is 0% and 1 is 100% of the maximum value, the maximum that you can get out of that particular action, whatever that is. And once we score everything the same from 0 to 1, where 1 is 100%, as an example, then we can compare it. We can compare apples to apples instead of comparing apples to oranges. And what I mean by that is you want the same comparison, being consistent. And if we do that, then we can really get the right utility out of a particular action or sets of actions. All right, so again, normalized scores are really important. And we've seen these values before, the 0 to 1 value. And we're going to see these values again. Sometimes it's -1 to 1, that we look at as an example. But some kind of normalized values is something that we want to look at, and we want to rescore everything based on this kind of range. So again, normalized scores, we can combine them very easily because we can weight them or we can average them, okay? And we can easily calculate any value within a set range of numbers, and they're easily comparable because they're on the same scale. And it doesn't matter if you're going to go 0 to 1 or 1 to 100 or whatever scale you're going to use, keep it the same. And again, it's important to note that any value range will work as long as there is consistency across different values or variables like we talked about. And if an AI agent scores an action with the value of 15, you should know immediately what that means, right? For instance, does 15 mean 15 out of 25 or 15%? What does that mean, right? So that's the thing you need to figure out. You need to figure out what that value means across your range, whatever the range is going to be for everything that you're doing. So again, you want to normalize everything so I can compare two values, average them, and then kind of compare when we do the comparison. Otherwise, the biggest problem is if we're comparing apples to oranges, something totally different, then we might get the wrong action at the end. The AI might choose something that's totally wrong, right? But it's really around the number that you've assigned, So there is in utility theory the principle of maximum utility. And so the key to decision making is to calculate a utility score, sometimes called a weight. Maybe we have a weighting for this. For every action the AI agent can take and then choose the action with the highest score. And of course, most game worlds are non-deterministic. And that means we don't want, a game world itself, it's not going to respond the exact same way everywhere, hopefully. Hopefully you haven't done that. And so calculating, the exact utility is not always or even usually possible. And so it's really hard to know if an action will be preferable if you can't determine the results of performing that action. You don't know what's going to happen. And so this is the heart of utility theory and where it's most useful because we want to kind of score all possible actions for that particular state in the game world that we're in right now. So the most common technique is to multiply the utility score by the probability of each possible outcome and sum up these weighting scores. Okay, a little bit of math. Sorry, I know. And this will give you something called the expected utility of the action. So probability is the chance that it's actually going to happen. And so, so a good example, or the chance that the agent will choose that action. Okay. Because if you always make it so that they choose the highest utility, then again, the agent becomes predictable. And we've talked about this over the last several weeks. We never want our AI to be predictable. We want it to be a little bit unpredictable in the real world. Here in your assignment 3 and 4, yeah, it's predictable because we want to be able to make it testable, a little bit more testable for you to make sure that, you know what, your AI is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And at a level 1 perspective, when we first program something like using a decision tree to exactly tell the AI what to do, is pretty good. I think it's, just to get it going like that. But adding probability as another twist to things, saying things like, okay, so here's a couple of actions you can take. So imagine assignment 4, and I said, okay, well, there's a 10% chance, that the first time the agent sees the player, he's going to flee. They're going to flee, run away. 10% chance, right? There's a 20% chance as soon as the AI sees the player that they're going to, kind of run to them right away and try and fight them right away, right? And that's a total of 30%, 10% for running away, 20% for immediately, kind of charging the player, maybe rushing into them or something. And then we have 70% left, and the 70% is what they're going to be doing most of the time. So we can split that up into a couple of different things. One of them is, using the detection radius, we've detected the player and then hunting them out, and all that kind of stuff. And by going into line of sight and all those kind of things that we programmed in assignment 4, we could do it that way. But the other chances, those little weird probabilities of doing things, is a number that we multiply by the utility score. So let's say we give it a ranking, something that's more important than something else. And this idea of scoring each possible action and their probability is this idea of expected utility. What's the expected utility of the action based on the actual value of the utility times the probability, whatever that probability that the agent will actually take that action. Another good example is, remember several weeks back we talked about, a couple weeks back we talked about behavior trees. And with behavior trees, we said one of the things we talked about was that we have a sequence. I want to open a door. I want to break down the door. I want to smoke the enemy out, or whatever. One of those 3 actions, and giving it a probability, because maybe each of those things are equal. The utility might be the exact same, right? So I'm going to get into the room. The utility might have a value of, let's say, from a 0 to 1. It's very important. We want to hunt down the player. Maybe that's the goal of the AI. And let's suppose we want to give it a utility value of 0.6. Okay, so 60%. It's really good. It's higher than normal. Okay, and let's suppose that we kind of spread out the probability of each of the other actions equally. So 0.3333. So either there's 1/3 chance that we're going to, it's almost like rolling a die, right? If we roll a 6-sided die, 1, 2, we're going to try and open the door. 3, 4, we're going to break the door down. We're not even going to try to open it, right? 5, 6, we're going to try and burn the building down and smoke them out, right? That's exactly the same as what I'm saying. It's 30% chance, 33% chance, every single one. Take that 33, multiply it by your 60% to actually do that action in the first place, right? Because that's the important thing. And you're looking at something that's a little bit smaller, and that's the expected utility value of that particular action, each of those actions, okay? And we can express it as the expected utility is the sum of all possible actions, and multiplied by the desire for that outcome. Again, the utility, that's the utility part, and multiplied by the probability. So that's sum of all actions doing that, okay? And this probability, again, is normalized so that the number is, of all probabilities, is 1. So again, we want, like I said, we have 3 possible choices, A, B, and C. They're all attacking the door, and some we're going through, or whatever. Everyone is going into the room. We're attacking the room, or breaking down the door, or whatever. And the total sum has to be 100% in that particular scenario. It can't go over 100% because there's only 3 choices. You're going to roll 1 die. As an example, or 2 dice, or whatever it's going to be. But it's going to, at the end of the day, you're going to separate the roll. Imagine if you're playing a, other type of game like Monopoly. In Monopoly, we're buying properties. It's all about acquisition, and one of the things is you're competing with each player, and you're trying to acquire the most wealth in the game and the most at the end the most properties, if you will. And when you're rolling the dice, you roll 2 dice, right? And the chances are, if you look at the probabilities, that you're probably going to roll a 6, 7, or 8 more likely than any other number, because when you roll 2 dice together, 2 6-sided dice, that's the probability. It's very rare that you're going to have boxcars, that's 12, or snake eyes, that's 2. So chances are, when you're looking at the board, as a player, as a human player, you're looking at it going, I'm probably going to roll 6, 7, or 8. I'm probably going to roll. There's a higher probability that I'm going to do these things. And if you look at the game like that, and again, it's kind of weird. When you're playing, you just want to roll and have a good time. But when you do that, you start thinking about things and you're like, wait, these are the probability. There's most of the 100% is going to go there. There's probably going to be 60% of the time or 70% of the time, I'm going to roll a 6, 7, or 8. And the other percentages, the other 30%, 15% is going to be, a 1 to 5. 2 to 5, and the other 15%, I'm just making this up here, is going to be a 9 to 12. Okay, where 12 is really low, like a 1% chance, and so is 2. But you're adding all those probabilities together to make it 100%. You can't go beyond that, right, for that particular chance. All right, so again, this is applied to every possible action that can be chosen, and the action with the highest expected utility, the highest EU, is chosen, and this is called the principle of maximum expected utility, based on the type of actions that we're going to make. Okay? So far we've seen how to calculate the utility given a set of outcomes. We have a bunch of outcomes, and how to combine the utility of multiple decision factors to arrive at a final utility for a decision. And the next step, so step 1. Step 2 is taking an arbitrary game value and converting it to a utility score. All right. So again, calculating the initial utility for a decision is really subjective. Like it really comes down to how you feel it should work. And 2 different programmers or 2 different game designers might write 2 different utility functions that produce very different outputs, even given the same inputs. Example, let's suppose when we're looking at a game and we're creating a damage system, okay, and I say that, I'm just going to put it out there for you. I want to calculate what the best weapon to use is, right? For the AI to use the best weapon against the player, based on the amount of damage it does, the type of damage it does. Let's say, for example, physical or energy type damage. Physical damage, it only, because, only does physical. Maybe it's edge damage or piercing damage or bludgeoning damage. That might be one category, physical. And then the energy type, maybe some kind of radiation or plasma energy or something else that the player, the weapon is going to cast, all right, as an example. And so what you do is you're starting to score your weapon in terms of utility. What is the utility for me firing this weapon compared to something else? Again, between the 2 of us, let's say if you guys were to sat down and I was going to select some values, I might select very different values for how I think that weapon would score in terms of utility compared to you. It's completely subjective. You might say, for example, that you really don't care about physical or energy damage. Maybe I do. You care about the total damage it's going to do. I care about all the other stuff. I even care about area of effect. What if it's going to be affecting 2 players? Or what if it's going to light up the ground somewhere or whatever? I want to be able to score the total effect that weapon is going to have. And by the way, a lot of people do this in an Excel spreadsheet. They put an Excel spreadsheet together and they calculate stuff in terms of damage per round, area of effect, how much, what type of damage it's going to do, and all that kind of stuff. And they give a value to that based on the type of armor that the opponent has. For example, if I have armor that can only protect me versus physical, then obviously the energy weapon is a better choice, right? Because I'm going to, and this is assuming that the AI is super smart. It's going to be able to tell that the player is wearing only armor that can defend against physical damage, right? As an example, right? This is where the probabilities come in. And you can say, well, if I have a low-level AI, you know what? It's 50-50. They don't know. They think that either one or the other weapon is the same, right? If I have a medium-level AI, maybe they'll inspect the player a little bit and they'll say, there's a 30% chance that they're going to select the right weapon, right? And if I have a high-level AI, a person who is an AI who is more experienced, there's a 70% chance that they're going to select the right weapon to destroy the player, okay? And That's where the utility comes in. It's all down to, probabilities and how you're going to score it, and it's very subjective. Okay, questions around that idea. I don't know if anyone's ever built anything like that, a damage system or anything like that in their game where they're deciding. I know a lot of you are making some kind of bullet and you're trying to think about how much damage each bullet takes from the player when the player gets hit, or how much damage the player's bullet does to the enemies. Sometimes it's just one shot, one kill, kind of thing. And other times it's like a portion of your health goes away, as an example. It could be that as well. All right, going back to calculating utility, a lot of times what we use is a linear curve. A linear curve is usually like a straight line with a constant slope. And the utility value is simply a multiplier of the input. I have input, whatever the input's going to be. The output is going to be on the line, whatever it's going to be, right? And here's the equation of this, where if I have utility, I take, the maximum value for that input and divide it, as an example, by some multiplier. And this idea is a lot of times giving you just a linear value, let's say, for example, of utility over time, utility over distance, utility over damage, whatever that is. And by the way, you can assign different values, right? This idea. So the greater damage, let's suppose the maximum damage that I can possibly give, with the gun I'm talking about is 100, let's say, as an example. And whatever that, the number is, as an example, that number that's going to be that multiplier, right, is going to produce whatever the utility is going to be for that particular damage type that the gun is going to do. Remember, I can add all these up to create almost like a value from 0 to 1 of the value of firing that weapon against, as an example, the player. Okay, so we could use a linear curve for this, which produces a constant slope. And sometimes, by the way, before we go into the little case study that I'm going to be talking about in a second, we could also use another kind of curve, right? A different kind of slope. And so it becomes, as an example, more like diminishing returns. So yes, it'll do more and more damage, but it'll get hotter and hotter. Or, there'll be a higher level cooldown, which will actually affect the utility of using that weapon, a weapon that does a lot more damage. Or let's say you have a power level setting, and you can set the weapon power from, 1 to 10, where 10 is maximum power and 1 is just stunning, okay, as an example. And again, you might say that there might be a place, if you have a curve, not a straight line, you might have a place where there's a kind of a sweet spot where it's going to do kind of the most damage for the least amount of heat, as an example. And that's where something that you can kind of figure out with, you can score that with utility. All right, let's talk about games that are out there that use it. And use utility theory. So Heart of Thorns, again, is something that's an ongoing game that's been around for a while. It's not new. And it uses something called the infinite axis utility system. And a major guiding principle of the design is that the AI should be data-driven as much as possible. Okay, so again, back to numbers, right? AI should all be about numbers. There's a number that turns on, that's going to be the decision that the AI makes. For the case study, for you to really understand the case study, I've posted a bunch of links up here on Blackboard. So I've got Guild Wars 2, what that is, and that's kind of this game that's ongoing. They keep on coming with new kind of DLCs and different releases and stuff like that lately. So what is Guild Wars? And there are a couple of GDC vaults that have been kind of produced, and so really interesting. They talk about, now this is kind of going way back. This is how old this stuff is, from 2010 and from, GDC 15, where these guys talked about utility theory for Guild Wars. It's very interesting how they did it. And it talks about, how to scale stuff. And especially when you're playing an MMO or some, kind of large scale game, how do you do it? How do you make it so that it's efficient? Where each AI has its own brain and still, the system is still able to operate and move forward. There's some great stuff in here that it talks about. And if you actually scroll through some of the slides that these guys have, It'll talk to you about how they use different pieces. They talked about different inputs that they use, and and they actually talk about a little bit of code, how to parameterize inputs, and how they can convert a distance to the target on a scale. Remember this idea of 0 to 1. There's that min-max idea that they want to do, right? And as they do it, they talk about this. If you actually go through the video, it's very interesting. The way they do this, they talk about this idea of an estimation value, and we're going to talk about the DSC in a second. But it's quite interesting the way they go through it. So again, it's a good watch. It's about an hour long, right? You can go a little fast if you want to watch through it. And there's some great stuff about how this works and why they chose to use utility theory as opposed to other ways of making decisions for their AI. And so it becomes more realistic, than let's suppose how they did it before. Another thing that's up there that I put up here as well is another article about AI that you can read. Again, they talked about different things here in terms of how they score and the type of curves that you can use. They discuss things like making decisions, and a lot of this I've kind of put into our little lecture for today, and it's interesting when it comes to what they call a compensation factor that you can use to make decisions. Okay, so that is your the architecture of Guild Wars is using utility theory, and really the idea here is that you're going to have this DSC, like back from the GDC talk, right? And the GDC is going to give you, it's called a decision score evaluator, right? So the decision score evaluator, again, it's almost like machine learning, right? We have kind of a DSC when we're making decisions in machine learning as well. And during a think cycle, so again, the think cycle is not going to be something that we're going to run every frame. The think cycle might take, as an example, several frames. Again, you don't want to have your AI responding every frame like we talked about before because of jitter, right? We don't want the AI to be jittery in terms of what it's going to do next. We want it to wait X number of frames, and that's something that you have to play with. And that's the think cycle. Let's suppose it takes, 20 frames for each decision that has to be made, some portion of a second. Or maybe it takes 2 frames, for it to happen. Maybe it's going to allow, 2 seconds, like a whole 2 seconds before it can make a decision. So it gets hit a couple times, or 1 second, or 2 seconds, or 1.5 seconds, whatever it is. And then, it's able to make that decision. The think cycle is around whatever the right number is for your game, okay? So each DSC, so the decision score evaluator for an agent is scored, and the best scoring option determines the action that the AI takes for that think cycle. And this is how they did it for Guild Wars, right? And the scoring of a DSC consists of accumulating all the scores of the considerations, right, assigned to that DSC. Okay, so consideration is essentially a raw numeric input normalized to the interval 0 to 1. And the score is processed through a response curve. Now, our response curve we just talked about was linear, like a very straight line. But you can have different types of response curves, like we talked about. So it could be, a curve that is not linear, a nonlinear curve. And that response curve is going to give you it's going to take that consideration, it's going to map it on the response curve, and it's going to come up with a decision score evaluator based on a bunch of other things that are happening at the same time. So again, suppose a DSC has 2 considerations. And when we think about considerations, those are almost like factors or properties to make it a determination, okay? So, or a decision. So here's the considerations. One consideration is the distance to the target, and the other consideration is the health of the target, whatever that the health is, right? Health can be a simple fraction. So remember, we're trying to convert health into a range of 0 to 1. So abstracting away from the detail of hit points or other mechanics that describe the healthiness of the target. Okay, some kind of fraction from 0 to 1. Right? Distance can be normalized by providing bookends. And they talk about this in the video. And bookends are like, okay, well, if I'm close to the target, what does close mean? Well, it really depends on And what about far? If I'm 100 meters away and I'm still in weapon range, is that the farthest I want to go? That's the outside bookend, almost like, I have a range of, values, and anything beyond that range is still the maximum value. I kind of clamp it within that range. So whether it's, if I'm within range from, let's say, 0, which is melee range, all the way to, let's say, 100 meters, which might be still firing range, I'm good. Anything beyond that, we ignore, and we kind of, score that whole thing as a 0, because guess what? You're out of range. And no matter what happens, anything over 100, you're out of range no matter what. Okay? So that's something we can do. And the normalization process will take any distance between 0 and 100 meters and map it to a score of 0 to 1. Anything beyond that, as an example, any distance above the maximum automatically scores a 1 because that is the extreme range. Or it could just say 0. You're just not, it's something, or -1, some other value that you can say, we're just not even considering that altogether. The distance is too far. The next step is to process these raw numbers via the response curves. So again, response curves can look different ways. And again, going back to the idea here, the things that they talk about in the GDC Vault, kind of thing, they talk about different response curves. I'm just going to go through here and see if I can show you a couple of the ones that they're talking about here, because depending on the response curve, it might be a diminishing return. So let's see if that is going to give me the right one. Again, I don't want to play the video. Here's one of the response curves. So this is a kind of response curve too, where again, this is diminishing returns, right? Where you get some return, some return, some return, finally it plateaus. And that idea of diminishing returns could be a type of response curve that you use, right, when it comes to how to map your value to the curve. And that remapping of values, right, is something that you're going to get your utility number back from the curve. That's what you're going to be doing. That's when you do the remapping. All right, so you process these numbers over the response curve. In this case, imagine that closer targets are more appealing than distance targets. Given a target that's 25 meters away, the raw consideration score would be 25 over 100, which is around 0.25. That's the consideration score. Passed through a suitable function, however, 25 meters might score as, say, 0.95. And this remap score allows the designer fine-grained control over the relative importance of each consideration, because, as an example, 0.95 might be, 25 meters might be the right spot. Remember that sweet spot I was talking about before? That might be the place that you want to go, because beyond that, it's diminishing returns, and that means that, like, if you go too far or too close, it's not the right number when it comes to you, firing your weapon or casting your spell or whatever you're going to do. Again, as the setup of the response curve, as well as the choice of input that is fed into it, is entirely data-driven, there's no engineering burden for modifying the preferences of the AI character. So you don't have to do that. It's just literally you make the curve, and then that curve of numbers is how you're going to map your decisions, which is kind of interesting the way it's done. So one of the key traits of this design is that any consideration can disqualify an entire decision from being selected simply by scoring 0. Okay, and as soon as the consideration drops to the decision score of 0, the system stops processing further considerations and early outs. So basically, does it continue if it's a loop or a break or something like that, moving on to the next decision. And this makes it trivial to encode rules for making a decision when a decision is absolutely not supposed to be used. So example, I'm firing a ranged weapon and I'm in melee combat. Okay, well, if I'm in melee combat, I can't use a ranged weapon because it's not going to work properly, right? I'm probably the guy who's got his a sword or claws or whatever he's got in front of me is probably going to hit me a lot faster than I can fire the weapon, right? And I'm going to be screwed up in terms of aiming, because if you've ever been into a fight before, it's hard to kind of aim something when there's a lot of movement happening, especially when it's very close. Again, it really depends on the skill level and everything else. And again, this is all contextual talk and really subjective, really super subjective. So additionally, it allows AI designers to optimize the decision evaluation process itself, since cheaper consideration can be ordered first and early out to avoid processing more expensive ones. And that means that if I want, a cheaper consideration, cheaper from a machine perspective, maybe that's also a factor. How much, CPU power and what other subsystems am I going to trigger by doing this, making this particular decision, compared to this other one? That's also a consideration you might think about from an engineering perspective. Example, I have a lot of animations and sounds tied to a particular action, right? And the only time I really want to take that action, because it takes a lot of energy, not just from the AI, but from the system to enact, is when it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, in order for me to enact that action properly, there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood, right? Maybe that's an expensive action, and maybe that I'm going to put that out as it takes a lot of energy. I'm going to relate that action because there's a lot of motion, a lot of animation. Maybe I'm going to score that as very high energy intensive action for the AI to make, even though for the AI, moving is moving, right? But we're going to add particle effects. We're going to add animations. We're going to add a bunch of stuff, and that might all weigh in to what decision the AI is going to make. Almost like it takes more energy to do that action. It's a really interesting way of thinking. So again, in Heart of Thorns, it focuses on this moment-to-moment tactical positioning and maneuvering of individual NPCs, and many characters have an archetypal style or flavor that they represent, and choices driving the movement of those characters in the battlefield have a substantial impact on how well the designer's intent is actually conveyed during gameplay, which is kind of really interesting, the way they talk about this. So here's one. So evade dangerous areas. Let's suppose this is a motivation, okay? A perfect example of is this. If the AI character is too close to such a danger zone, they will rapidly exit the area, often playing a specific dodge animation and momentarily avoiding any incoming attacks. Oftentimes in the dodge animation, what we do is we add in invulnerability frames, right? And these invulnerability frames are tied into, the DSC of that particular action. I know if I'm doing that dodge action, I'm probably not going to get hit, as an example, if I do that. Now, I can't also, when I'm dodging, maybe we can't fire a weapon or, make a melee attack or something else. It discounts a lot of the other actions that we can possibly do. But if my motivation is to evade dangerous areas, right, the intelligent character is going to do that as much as possible, right? So here's some considerations for evade dangerous areas. We want to prevent action from being chosen in the middle of another action. So that's one thing we have to think about. We have to detect nearby dangerous activities and locales, all right? We have to stop choosing this decision after a certain number of repetitions because it gets a little bit too predictable. And the health value of the autonomous character, the higher the score, the lower the need to evade dangerous areas. Because if my health value is really, really high, well, who cares? I can probably survive a hit or two, as an example. So a bunch of different considerations to use for evading dangerous areas. Here's another one. Close to melee when visible. When invisible. Okay, now this is interesting. So imagine if you have the capability of going into stealth mode, as an example, or I don't know, hiding, or whatever it's going to go, or actually becoming invisible with a spell, right? So much like its evade dangerous areas counterpart, close to melee when invisible is a decision score evaluator that attempts to move a character into a more advantageous position on the battlefield. However, it is much less likely applicable because only a few characters can be invisible at all. Invisible, again, might be stealth, might be using some kind of concealment value, or whatever, however you're going to plan that out. And not all of them want to get closer to their enemies when they are hidden from view. Some of them want to get out of there, right? Because that's another motivation that's in effect at the same time. So again, here's some considerations for close to melee when invisible. We want to prevent the decision from activating on immobilized or otherwise occupied characters. So if the autonomous character is immobilized, they can't move, or they're already occupied doing another activity, that shouldn't be allowed. And the other thing is, make sure that the character is still invisible, if they can do that. And move closer to the target if the autonomous character can reach the target before turning invisible, right? So these are all considerations that you have to think about. You have to make that calculation. So if I move closer to the target, am I going to turn invisible? Is my stealth mode going to go off before I get there? Is the health value too low to risk this action? Because this is kind of a high risk action. If I'm if I'm engaging in melee combat, as an example, maybe if my health is low, I don't care if I can be invisible. I'm not going to do that at all, right? There might be another factor involved, like I said before. Okay, questions around utility, right? The stuff that we've talked about and the Guild Wars example. Guild Wars, I highly recommend you guys take a look at that case study. I think it's great learnings. GDC Vault there's a ton of things you can learn from there. And there's some great videos, even if they're a little older, like 2010, some of the same technologies being used today in today's games. All right, let's talk about action execution a little bit. So we've been talking about actions throughout the decision-making process the entire time. Everything from decision trees, state machines, behavior trees, rule-based systems, goal-oriented behavior, and now, utility. They all generate actions. And the result of each decision-making technique is simply a snippet of code that calls some function, we saw that in the lab this week, that tweaks some state variable or asks a different bit of the game, AI, physics, rendering, whatever, to perform some task. I want to move, I want to flee, I want to wait behind cover, I want to detect my line of sight, I want to do all these things. These are all the actions. So that is what's going to happen. So how do I execute that action? So again, we can divide the kinds of actions that result from AI decisions into 5 different flavors, let's say. State change actions, right? So I'm moving from one type of state to the other. Animations, movement, AI requests, right? And interface commands. Yeah, so different kinds of actions we can take. And one thing I always ask the class, and I think I've asked you guys maybe in the past, is the difference between locomotion and animation. Again, locomotion would be movement. Animation is some kind of movement, especially if it's in 3D, of the character's body or weapons or items or props or whatever within the character model itself or within the character object container, whatever that is. That is really animation. Whereas locomotion, you move from one kind of location in the game world to another. Okay, so that's why these things are separate. So state change actions, okay, the simplest kind of action, simply changing some piece of the game state. A lot of times they're not visible directly. An autonomous character may change the firing mode of its weapon, for example, or use one of its health packs. Again, not really that visible. There might be an associated animation for this one that the player carries them out. For other characters, they simply involve a change in a variable somewhere in the game state. So again, for players, we might actually see an animation. For NPCs, there might be an animation, a small one or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of times done with a change in a variable, which we don't see. Okay. More realistic games actually show the animation too. Animations are the most primitive kind of visual feedback, and it could be a particle effect when a character casts a spell, or a quick shuffle of the hands to indicate a weapon reload. And a lot of times combat is simply a matter of animation, whether it be the recoil from a gun, sheltering behind a raised shield, a lengthy combo sword attack, whatever it's going to be, but they're all just animations. And we can make them really spectacular and whatever, but at the end of the day, that is the effect, the visual feedback we're going to give to the player to let them know that some kind of attack or action is being performed. Okay. Actions may also require the character to make some kind of movement through the game level, and a decision-making algorithm that tells an autonomous character to run for cover. We talked about this for assignment 4, right? Or to collect a nearby power-up or chase after an enemy is all producing some kind of movement action. Okay. So a lot of times they're passed through the physics system if you have some kind of platformer or 3D game. AI requests for complex character, a high-level decision-making algorithm may be used, with deciding which lower-level decision-making algorithm to use. The AI controlling one team, as an example, in a real-time strategy game, may decide that it's time to build. Again, so that's an AI request that I need to build or gather resources or attack the player. That's a higher level decision. And that's an AI request. Again, it's something that is not visible typically, and it's something that's triggered inside of the AI brain itself. Finally, interface commands. They do not change the state of the game, but demonstrate to the user what's happening. It could be a sound effect, a dialogue snippet, schedule a particle system, update in the UI itself to show that something is cooling down, a weapon is cooling down or activated, all those kind of things. Those are all actions that have to be made that are linked to a particular decision. So when we think about a single action, an action itself is the output from a decision-making tool, and it may combine any or all of these flavors. In fact, a lot of times actions are, at least two of these things are put together to create that one action. Example, reloading a weapon involves both a state change, replenishing the ammo and the gun from the overall total belonging to the character, and to an animation, the hand shuffle, that idea. Running for cover may involve an AI request to a pathfinding algorithm, movement following the path, and animation, waving the hands over the head in panic, as an example. And deciding to build something, let's say for a real-time strategy game or something, may involve more AI, choosing what to build, and animation. The construction yard's chimney starts smoking, or something starts to happen that you can see in the game itself. So a bunch of actions that combine together to create a single action, almost like a composite action. Actions involving any animation or movement take time. That's another thing that you have to think about, right? If I want to move from A to B, and again, I'm thinking about it doesn't matter whether you're playing a role-playing game, a tabletop role-playing game, or whether you're playing a game that is, our video game. If I want to move from one part of the screen to the other, that's going to take time. If I want to move from one part of the board game to the other, it's going to take time, right? And a number of segments, let's say, turn segments or whatever you want to call it, right? And states changes, it might be immediate, and AI requests can be honored straight away, but most actions will take some time to complete, and that's important to note. So in general, we might have an action manager that will need to cope with actions that take time, and we can't simply complete the action in that particular instant. So what we're talking about is now another subsystem. We're designing a subsystem to be able to handle these timings, of different kinds of action components, and then put them together in the right order in order for the action to be complete, which is kind of interesting. We've been talking this entire time about, okay, we're going to make this action happen, but when do we know that that action is complete? Well, when all of the different components, these different flavors that are tied into that one single action get completed. So again, a lot of times the decision-making algorithm keeps scheduling the same action every frame, or every frame it is called, until the action is completed. And this has the advantage that the action can be interrupted at any time, but it means that the decision-making system, the subsystem that we're building, is being constantly processed and may have to be more complex than necessary. Okay, so that's one thing. Example would be moving. Oh, I made it. Okay, that's what this means. Firing. Okay, good. We've run out of ammo. Cool. Reloading. We've reloaded. Good. And that's the way it can work. Okay, that's the idea that they're talking about here. Take, for example, a state machine with a sleeping and on guard state. When the character wakes up, it will need to carry out a wake up action, probably involving an animation and maybe some movement. Okay. Similarly, when a character decides to take a nap, it will need this go to sleep action that needs to happen. If we need to continually wake up or go to sleep every frame, then the state machine will require 4 states. All right. So again, sleep. If we're rested, we wake up, right? We play the wake up animation. When it's complete, we're go on guard. When we get tired, we go to sleep. And go to sleep requires the go to sleep animation. And finally, we're at sleep. We're in sleep state. Okay, so those are the 4 states: sleep, wake up, on guard, or go to sleep. Okay. So again, it's not a problem when we only have 2 states to transition between, because we just talked about really 2 transitions: on guard, sleep. That's really the transition we're doing. But allowing transitions between 5 states would involve 40 additional transition states, and it soon scales out of control. And if we can support actions with some duration, again, the wake up action will simply be requested on exiting the sleep state. the go to sleep action will likewise be carried out when entering the sleep state. In this case, the state machine doesn't need to be continually processing. We don't need to do that, right? And so we're not running it every frame. We're not running it in an update function or something like that, okay? After it signals that it is waking up, we can wait until the character has played its waking animation before moving into the next action, okay? So sometimes because actions take time, they may start off being appropriate things to do, but may end up being completely inappropriate long before the action is complete. Example again, if an autonomous character is sent off wandering toward a power-up, and it will appear silly if it continues toward the power-up after a squad of enemy units spring their ambush. It's time to stop going after the power-up and run away because something has changed, right? Remember we talked about that alarm condition? This is the idea here. When an alarm condition happens, we interrupt the normal flow of moving from one state to the other, and now we do something completely different because that would happen in real life for us. All right. So again, if a decision-making system decides that an important action is needed, then it should be able to interrupt other actions currently being carried out. Again, if we're thinking about this virtual idea of a fantasy of an action manager subsystem that takes care of all actions in the game for AIs, it should allow actions with higher importance to interrupt the execution of actions with lower importance. Okay. Again, it's rare for autonomous characters in a game to be doing only one thing at a time, and the action of an autonomous character is typically layered. Okay, so they might be playing a gesture animation while moving around the level, while pursuing an enemy, while using a health pack. Okay, that can all be happening all at the same time. Okay, that's something that can happen, and it's common. It's a common implementation strategy to split these actions up so they are generated by different decision-making processes. Again, it's almost like I want to create an action subsystem, and I want to be able to schedule all these things to happen. A scheduling system for the AI is what we're talking about here. We might use one simple decision-making algorithm to monitor health levels and schedule the use of a health pack, so a separate AI, like little part of the brain, if you will. And we might use another decision-making algorithm to choose which enemy to pursue. All right, so that's something that we're going to do as well. So remember, we built in lab, we built one AI brain, and that one AI brain governed the entire actions. Imagine making multiple AI parts, multiple AI decision-making components or algorithms, where it's not just about hunting the player, but also about reloading, about gathering, loot or something else, right? And maybe there's a governor, something that's higher level, that's going to decide which of those actions to take. And it could be, we could put it in a state machine, we could put it in a decision tree, we could put it in a behavior tree, lots of ways of doing that kind of thing. So again, the action manager needs to accumulate all these actions and determine which ones can be layered and which ones can't. All right, because sometimes there's certain actions that have to wait. There's something that's synchronous. I have to wait, or one action is completed before the other action can start. A lot of times we call these synchronous actions blocking, or there's dependencies. This action can't be complete until these other dependencies are met, whatever those dependencies are. All right, an alternative is to have decision-making algorithms that output the compound actions themselves. All right, so again, in a strategy game, we may need to coordinate several actions in order to be successful. The decision-making system might decide to launch a small attack at a strong point in the enemy defense while making a full-strength flanking assault. So two different things happening at the same time. Both actions need to be carried out together, and it would be difficult to coordinate separate decision-making routines to get this effect. Imagine if I had to schedule both those things in a scheduler or something like that. That's way more challenging than actually having both of these two things fire at the same time. Okay. Let's talk about scripted actions. A lot of times developers talk about scripted AI in a way that has nothing to do with scripting languages, right? So scripted AI is, this context usually means a set of pre-programmed actions that will always be carried out in a sequence by an autonomous character. We've talked about sequences using behavior trees, but there's a lot of other ways of doing that as well. So there's no decision making involved. The script is always run from the start. Example, a scientist character may be placed in a room. When the player enters the room, the script starts running. That's the trigger, right? The character rushes to a computer bank, that's the autonomous character, starts the self-destruct sequence, and then runs for the door and escapes. Doesn't matter what you do. It has nothing to do with line of sight or any of that stuff. It's just a scripted action. And a lot of these times, these scripted actions are really great for things like cutscenes. We want, something to happen where, you're playing a game and as a good example, you stop the player from having input. The player is actually sitting here, at one part of the level. And what you're doing is you're moving the camera to another part of the level. And when you're moving the camera to the other part of the level, then you give the character, once you show what you want to show, you give the character back control. All right, that idea. And you can create almost a scripted, little small cutscene, but not even a cutscene, almost like an action scene that you're going to make, that you're going to give, knowledge to the player. A lot of times we can see this in a show where we cut to the villain doing something, or to we call them non-player characters. The non-player characters are doing something, you can actually see what they're doing. Meanwhile, the player character, the person's moving through the level, and we cut back and forth between the two to kind of enhance conflict or tension or whatever it's going to be. Kind of an interesting storytelling mechanism. So scripted actions are pretty cool. So again, primitive actions such as move to a point, play an animation, or shoot can be combined into these little short scripts that can be treated as a single action. And a decision-making system can decide to carry out a decision script that will then sequence a number of primitive actions, whatever those primitive actions are going to be. Scripted actions are similar to compound actions, but their elements are executed in sequence. And if we allow compound actions to be part of a sequence, then the autonomous character can perform any number of actions at the same time and in any number of actions in any sequence. And this gives us a powerful mechanism for telling stories, actually, more than anything else. Okay? Putting it all together. So we've been talking all this whole time about making actions. So an alarm mechanism is updated every frame, and it can schedule emergency actions if needed. That's something that we need to do. So that's number one. Two, the queue of actions is then queued. We put all these actions in some kind of queue for the manager to control. As an example, we're talking about an action manager system now, right? There is a single decision-making system, which is called whenever the action queue is empty. Okay, so that is, there's nothing to do, there's no action in the action queue, we're going to call that decision-making system. When a valid action is in the queue, it is sent to be executed, okay? And the execution may be performed by sending requests to the game state, the animation controller, the movement AI, or some subsystem that we're going to make that's going to work. And it might look something like this. We have an action manager, as an example. We have an action queue, some kind of decision-making algorithm, right? An alarm system, and an action execution subsystem that's going to take care of all that stuff together. So why are we talking about this? Because, when I look at this with you guys, you might say, well, none of that is kind of relevant to what we're doing with assignment 3 or 4. You're right. We're talking about architecture. I'm thinking about ways, if I was going to make a more complex AI, something that's going to work across, different systems. Maybe I have multiple AI characters in the game at the same time, many of them in the level. I want all of them to have priority based on an action manager. So the action manager is going to take control of all of the AI actions, almost like an overseer, if you will, that's going to manage everything together. And it's important because if you don't do this, then what's going to happen is some of those funky actions, if you just let the AI decision brain work on its own, could have a bunch of really negative effects. One, super impact on your CPU. So your game might really slow down if there's, as an example, 5 autonomous agents, AI agents in the screen. That's going to affect you. They start calculating distances. They're starting to calculate line of sight. They're starting to calculate collision detection. They're doing all this stuff all at once at the same time, every frame, right? And maybe it's more efficient to schedule it to happen. So you put it in a schedule and you're saying, okay, now it's your turn, now it's your turn, now it's your turn. Now back to you, back to you, back to you, now back to you, and so on. And the action manager is going to, kind of make all that possible. And so an AI subsystem, an actual subsystem as part of the game engine architecture we're talking about would kind of take control of this whole thing and perform action execution in a more organized manner than for just something's happening every frame. Okay, that's really the end of my talk for utility AI and action execution. Any questions around this, or any thoughts? Maybe even any kind of thoughts on if you were going to put together something like this yourself, as you continue your career as a game programmer, think about yourself building your own game engine, and that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts? Do you think this might be complex? Is it interesting to you? Not interesting? What are your thoughts? Rhetorical question. I'll let you think about that for a second, but let's go to the last part. So lab 7, while you guys are thinking about those things, we really talked about, so we didn't really get around to sprites and sprite sheets. We're going to try and conquer that next lab 8, or obstacle avoidance. We did program more actions, and we also recreated the ranged combat enemy decision tree on Tuesday to match the diagram, as opposed to that very simple way of doing it the first time around. So we kind of refactored everything. We also refactored a bunch of other stuff, knowing about the agent. We've really, kind of re-engineered, kind of the entire decision tree brain, if you will, of the agent from the ground up. And we're going to, if you notice, it's all iterative. One thing that I want you guys to take away from this development, and the stuff that you should be taking away from this course more than anything else, is that the stuff that we're doing in C++ for AI, actually we're going to see the same kind of stuff next semester for physics. It's all iterative. We make a basic, kind of function or basic algorithm that works. Maybe it's not totally efficient. Maybe it's a little bit buggy. Maybe it's a little bit jittery or twitchy. And then we refactor it and we make it better. It can make one decision and quickly switch to another decision. We refactor it and add in delay and so on. And we keep on doing this refactoring and reworking until we're there. It's like I said to you guys before in other contexts, it's when I talk to my artist friends, they do the exact same thing, right? Which is when they're painting something, or when they're rendering something, drawing something, or using some kind of tool, they start off very basic and they keep on iterating and iterating and changing stuff, and it's not right. I've heard this from many artist friends of mine. It's not right until it is. It's not right until it is. This idea of not right until it is exactly the way we program as well. There's a relationship between almost like programming and art in this way. We keep iterating and iterating and iterating until we have the right effect, until we have the exact action or feature or functionality that we're looking for. And it can take time and reworking and testing and retesting and trying to break that feature multiple times in multiple ways. Okay? All right, that's it for me today. Just as a reminder, let's just go back up and do a little bit more admin. Remember that your Lab 7, if you haven't had a chance to do that, we've got all the videos up online on Blackboard. Please make sure you go through the videos and submit your Lab 7 Part 1, 2, 3, which is worth 12% maximum of your final grade this Sunday. This is an individual thing you need to do. There's no combining with anybody else, so please make sure you do this as soon as you can. If you haven't had a chance to watch the videos, it's an important piece, and it relates to assignment 4, because if you understand how to do this, you have one way of making the decisions. We've introduced decision trees for you this semester, and that's the way we're doing it. However, I also want to say again that assignment 4 does not have to be done with decision trees. If you wanted to use state machines or behavior trees, even if you wanted to make a hard-coded state machine instead of a class-based state machine to make it work, totally fine with that. I'm totally fine however it works, as long as the features, the requirements are met in the assignment document. So please go through the assignment document and go through it one thing at a time and make sure the features that I've requested from you are met. That's how you're going to get the maximum marks. Okay, any questions before we go for the day? And then I'll see you guys next Tuesday in class, in person. All right, if there's no questions, I'm going to stop recording here on YouTube, and then I'll come back to you and I'll stick around for any other kind of concerns you might have. Otherwise,